If the Palazzo del Te seems pagan in spirit, it's not just because it was given over to pleasure. The idea of the Renaissance was one of revival, to recover the art, literature and music of Greece and Rome in its original spirit, not as censored and sanitized by later Christian interpretations. To men and women of the Renaissance, the stories of the Greeks were the highest form of literature and powerful subject matter for painting and, eventually, for musical drama. These murals were painted by Giulio Romano, the only Renaissance artist to be mentioned by Shakespeare. They depict a story from Greek mythology. Jove, the king of the gods, punishes the giants for their rebellion and imprisons them under the earth. One advantage to the Renaissance artist of dealing with classical and mythological themes was that these bypassed the restrictions and inhibitions that had characterized the Christian art of the Middle Ages. Christian convention demanded that creatures in human form, even if naked, must assume a relatively modest pose. Satyrs, half goat, half man, and transmogrified gods were at no such disadvantage. Vincenzo Gonzaga's quest for pleasure didn't stop at the Palazzo del Te. He often went to the court at Ferrara, where, among the other attractions of the court, was a trio of beautiful lady singers who gave concerts of madrigals. Vincenzo didn't want to be outdone by a rival court, so he decided to try and set up a similar ladies' singing group at Mantua. His motives may not have been purely artistic. When he tried to sign up Caterina Martinelli, for instance, who was then in her early teens, to join his group, her father would only allow Caterina to enter the Duke's service provided that she lived in Monteverdi's house, where the composer's wife could act as a singing teacher and also as a chaperone. But it was with the talents of singers like Caterina in mind that Monteverdi produced some of his best madrigals. The subject of these five-part songs is generally love and sex, though sex is never actually mentioned specifically. In England at this same period, sexual ecstasy was called a little death, and the same idea is there in Monteverdi's madrigal Sich'io vorrei morire, which means, oh, how I'm longing for death. Few modern governments would spend such a large slice of their income on painting and music as the Gonzagas did, and the budget depended on the prosperity of the state.
Obviously, a large town of 30,000 people calls for a number of different skills. It calls for people who bake bread, people who catch fish, people who rear beef cattle for meat, and so on. But beyond that, Mantua was famous for one particular activity, and that was cloth weaving, particularly the rich, luxurious cloths, often involving cloth of gold, which you see in the portraits painted of the Gonzaga dukes and their courtiers. This luxury production was very, very important in the life of Mantua. In the 1570s, something like 14,000 entire cloths were woven. We can say that the textile industry is doing well, but that only affects perhaps a quarter of the population, an important quarter. But how many loaves of bread are baked? How many people are actually out cutting straw? How many people are out catching fish? These are things we don't know.
We also know very little about everyday life in Mantua. These murals provide only a glimpse. We do know the waters encircling Mantua were full of disease, particularly malaria. Monteverdi's letters complain about agues and fevers, and in those days the doctor's remedies were often more dangerous than the disease. Prisons in Renaissance Italy were terrible places, but the Gonzagas were not so much liberal as lazy, and heretics and dissidents had much less to fear in Mantua than in other city-states. The Gonzagas expended far less energy persecuting their religious and political opponents than in breeding their horses, which were famous all over Europe for sport and war. At one time, the Gonzagas were reported to have fielded a cavalry force 1,600 strong. And when Vincenzo campaigned, he took with him a personal bodyguard of some 50 archers. This is the room in the ducal palace where the archers were housed. Unusual frescoes give a clue as to how the inhabitants might have spent their spare time.
You can't listen to music each night, all night. Games, I think, were the foremost activity for a dark winter's evening. Games of cards, games of dice. Duke Vincenzo leading the way. One night he lost 50,000 crowns in a single night. That's more than he spent on the entire Hungarian campaign. Also, curious games concerning the identification of horses. So, it doesn't sound very promising, but the idea was that you had a curtain which was slightly drawn back in order to reveal a part of a horse, a fetlock, a nose, a tail, and you had to guess which horse it was. Obviously, money would be bet, and the person who was successful would scoop the pool.
The archers who played this game were paid much the same as Monteverdi. It was a good deal less than the Duke gave his best solo singers, and Monteverdi's letters frequently complain about how little he was paid, and how late. One reason why Vincenzo was often pushed for funds was that he sometimes had to fork out for expeditions against the Turks, who were in Hungary. It was partly vanity. Vincenzo, like a lot of the other Gonzagas, saw himself coming home covered in glory. And yet these expeditions were also a duty. In 1530, the Gonzagas had come under the protection of the Habsburg emperors. They were dukes of the Holy Roman Empire. So, if the emperor summoned, Vincenzo, as his vassal, had to go. In the first campaign, in 1595, Monteverdi went along too, and he took 5 other musicians in order to perform vespers every evening. The emperor at this time was Rudolph II, and he got a lot in common with Duke Vincenzo. They were both of them interested in magic and astrology, and more relevant to what they were supposed to be doing, in archery. One of Vincenzo's pastimes was alchemy, and he wrote back from his tent asking his court alchemists to devise cannonballs that could be filled with chemicals which would poison the Turks or put them to sleep. These proved less than a total success. It was all very expensive, and this and later equally futile campaigns gradually drained away Mantua's resources. Vincenzo had never been one to economize anyway, At his coronation, he bought cheap popularity by remitting half the tax on wine. He dug another hole in the revenues by building himself a pleasure palace on a nearby lake. On the occasion of a dynastic wedding, he mounted a naval regatta. Any festivity was an excuse for a theatrical spectacle, pastoral plays with music and dancing, and later, opera. For the pre-Lent Carnival of 1607, Monteverdi was paid to write a music drama based on the Greek legend of Orpheus, whose song could enchant all creatures. We know that Orfeo was first performed here at the Ducal Palace, but in which of the 500 rooms is uncertain. The opera begins with a fanfare. Wherever the opera was performed, the fanfare, the toccata, probably heralded the arrival of the Gonzaga family before the drama began. Monteverdi's Orfeo is the first opera of real substance and a landmark in the history of music. The betrothal of Orpheus and Eurydice is presented as a pastoral dance scene typical of the theatrical entertainments Vincenzo and the court enjoyed.
The whole of the opening of the opera is very pastoral in tone, sort of idealized landscape. One could think of it rather like a Poussin painting, perhaps. And Monteverdi achieves this by a whole succession of really quite simple music, songs, dances, and so on.
Mira de mir Orfeo, ed ogni intorno, ride il bosco e ride il prato, segui pur col pletra orato, da dolci l'aria in si beato gioco.